The night I finally walked out of my husband's family home, I didn't slam the door. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply picked up my coat, looked at the people who had spent years blaming me for everything that went wrong in their lives, and said 4 words that changed all of our lives. "You'll manage without me." They laughed. My mother-in-law actually smiled. My husband, Daniel, looked at me as if I had finally lost my mind. But nobody understood what I had already decided. I wasn't taking revenge. I was taking back something that had always belonged to me. And by the time they realized what I had walked away with, it was already too late. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 36 years old. I live in Pennsylvania, and for almost 11 years, I believed that being a good wife meant accepting everything quietly. I believed family meant forgiveness. I believed marriage meant standing beside your husband even when his family made you feel like an outsider. Most importantly, I believed that if I loved people long enough, eventually they would love me back. I was wrong. Before I tell you how everything fell apart, if you enjoy emotional family stories about betrayal, marriage, and finding the strength to walk away, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. And if this story reminds you of someone who always gets blamed for everything, leave a like. Now let me take you back to where this all started. I met Daniel at a small coffee shop in Pittsburgh. He was 30 when we met, working as an operations manager for a construction company. He was funny, patient, and incredibly attentive. At least, that's who I thought he was. 3 months after our first date, he introduced me to his parents. His father, Richard, barely looked at me. His mother, Linda, hugged me tightly and said, "Daniel has never brought anyone home before." I thought she meant it as a compliment. I didn't understand the warning hidden inside those words. Daniel had one younger sister, Jessica. From the first day I met her, she made it clear that she didn't like me. She would smile whenever Daniel held my hand, but the smile never reached her eyes. At dinner, she asked me questions that sounded innocent but never were. "How much do you make? Do you own your house? Do you plan on having kids?" I answered politely. I didn't want to create problems. After dinner, Daniel squeezed my hand in the car. "Don't worry about my family," he said. "They're just protective." That sentence would become something I heard hundreds of times over the next decade. Whenever his mother insulted me, Daniel said she was protective. Whenever his sister blamed me, Daniel said she was stressed. Whenever his father treated me like I wasn't good enough, Daniel said that was just how his father was. And whenever I finally reached my limit, Daniel would look at me and say, "Please don't make this bigger than it is." So I learned to swallow my feelings. We married a year later. I thought marriage would change things. It didn't. If anything, it got worse. The first major argument happened 6 months after our wedding. Daniel's parents were hosting Thanksgiving. I spent 2 days preparing food. I made homemade apple pie, mashed potatoes, green beans, turkey stuffing, and a chocolate cake because Jessica had once told me it was her favorite. When I arrived, Linda looked at the desserts and frowned. "You made chocolate cake?" I nodded. "Jessica doesn't eat chocolate anymore?" I looked at Jessica. She shrugged. "I told you that last year." She hadn't, but I apologized anyway. Dinner went badly. The turkey was apparently too dry. The potatoes were too salty. The cake was too sweet. And somehow, by the end of the evening, everyone was irritated. When we got into the car, Daniel sighed. My mom was upset. "So why are you blaming me?" He didn't answer. That silence told me everything, but I stayed because I loved him. At least I thought I did. Over the next few years, I became the person everyone called whenever they needed something. Linda needed help with appointments. I drove her. Richard needed paperwork organized. I did it. Jessica needed someone to watch her children. I changed my schedule. Daniel needed help with his business paperwork. I stayed up until midnight. And every time something went wrong, somehow my name appeared in the conversation. If Linda missed an appointment, I hadn't reminded her. If Jessica's children got sick, I must have exposed them to something. If Daniel made a mistake at work, I had distracted him. If Richard's finances became complicated, I supposedly hadn't helped enough. I became the family scapegoat. And the strangest part? I started believing them. I started asking myself, maybe I really am the problem. Then came the one thing that changed everything. Daniel's father suffered a serious financial setback. The family-owned construction company was drowning in debt. Richard needed money, a lot of it. And suddenly, the family that had spent years telling me I wasn't really one of them began treating me very differently. Linda called me every morning. Jessica started inviting me to lunch. Richard suddenly wanted to discuss my career. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what. Until one afternoon, I found a folder on Daniel's desk. My name was written across the front. Underneath, it were 3 words. Emergency funding plan. I opened it. And what I discovered inside made my hands shake. Because my husband had been planning to use something I owned to save his family's business. Something they had never known they needed. Something I had inherited years before I ever met Daniel. And for the first time in 11 years, I understood why his family had suddenly started acting so nice. They didn't love me, they needed me, and they were about to find out what happened when the woman they blamed for everything finally stopped helping them. I stared at that folder for almost 5 minutes without touching another page. My hands were cold. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it. I knew I should have closed the folder. I knew I should have walked away. But after 11 years of being told I was imagining things, being told I was too sensitive, and being blamed for problems I didn't create, something inside me refused to stay quiet. So I kept reading. The first page contained a list of the family's debts. The construction company owed nearly $380,000. There were unpaid suppliers, late equipment payments, credit lines that were almost maxed out. And then I saw the number that made my stomach drop. $214,000. Next to it were the words, possible immediate solutions Sarah's inherited property. I stopped breathing for a moment. My property, the small lake house my grandmother had left me, it wasn't a mansion. It wasn't some luxurious vacation home. It was a modest 3-bedroom house near Lake Erie that had belonged to my grandmother for decades. She had raised my mother there during summers. When she died, she left the property to me. My mother had warned me never to let anyone pressure me into selling it. That's the one thing your grandmother wanted you to keep, she had told me. I had listened. The house was fully paid off. I had never used it as collateral. I had never borrowed money against it. And apparently, my husband's family had discovered its value. I turned the page. There was a handwritten note. If Sarah agrees to refinance or sell the property, we can cover the immediate debt and keep the company alive. Underneath it was another sentence. Daniel needs to convince her this is the only way to protect the family. I read that line 3 times. Daniel needs to convince her, not ask me, not discuss it with me. Convince me, I closed the folder. For several minutes I sat at his desk in silence. Then I heard the front door open. Daniel was home. I quickly placed the folder exactly where I had found it. He walked into the room carrying 2 grocery bags. Hey, he said. I looked at him. Where were you? At my parents' house. He put the groceries down. Everything okay? I almost laughed. Yes. He looked at me for a moment. You seem upset. I'm tired. He nodded. Then he kissed my forehead. That tiny gesture almost broke me, because I remembered the man I had married. The man who used to bring me coffee in bed. The man who once drove 4 hours through a snowstorm because I had forgotten my favorite sweater at my mother's house. I wanted to believe he wasn't part of this. I wanted to believe his family had created this plan without him, so I gave him a chance. Daniel? Yeah. If your family ever had a serious financial problem, would you ask me for help? He froze, only for a second, but I noticed. Of course, he said, even if it involved something important to me. What do you mean? Nothing, he smiled. Sarah, we're married. What's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. I stared at him. That sentence sounded romantic once. Now it sounded like a warning. The next morning, Linda called. Sarah, sweetheart, can you come over this afternoon? I almost said no. Instead, I said, sure. When I arrived at their house, everyone was there. Richard was sitting at the dining room table. Jessica was on the couch. Daniel was standing near the window, and Linda had prepared coffee and pastries. It felt like a meeting. Linda smiled. "Sit down, honey." I sat. Richard cleared his throat. "We need to talk about the company." I waited. He explained everything. The debts, the equipment, the suppliers, the employees, the possibility of losing the business. I listened without interrupting. Then Linda reached across the table and touched my hand. "We're family." There it was, the word they had rarely used when I needed them. Family. Richard leaned forward. "We need a temporary financial solution." I already knew where this was going. Daniel finally spoke. "Sarah, your lake house could solve this." I looked at him. Nobody said anything. I asked quietly, "How did you know about the property?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. "My parents knew." I turned toward Linda. "You knew?" She nodded. "We've always known." I looked at Jessica. She avoided eye contact. Then Richard said, "We're not asking you to give it away." No, you could refinance it." I shook my head. "Or sell it," Jessica added. I looked at her. "You want me to sell my grandmother's house?" "It would only be temporary," Daniel said. "Temporary? We'd pay you back." "When?" Nobody answered. I looked at Richard. "How much would you pay me?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "If I sell the property for $214,000, what exactly am I getting back?" Silence. That was when I understood. They didn't have a repayment plan. They had an expectation. They expected me to sacrifice something precious so they could continue their lives exactly as they were. Linda's expression changed. "Sarah, you're being selfish." I stared at her. "Selfish?" "Yes." Jessica crossed her arms. "You have no children, you have a stable job, you don't even live there." I felt something inside me crack. That house wasn't valuable because I lived there. It was valuable because it was the last piece of my grandmother I had. I stood up. "I'm not selling it." Daniel stood too. "Sarah, please." "No, you don't understand what's at stake." "I understand perfectly." Richard's voice became hard. "If this company closes, 32 people could lose their jobs." I looked at him. "And that's my responsibility." Nobody answered. I picked up my purse. Linda suddenly started crying. "You're destroying this family." I stopped. For 11 years, I had heard that sentence in different forms. "You're causing problems. You're selfish. You're difficult. You're not understanding. You're destroying the family." But something was different this time. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I simply said, "I'm not destroying anything." Then I looked at Daniel. "You are asking me to destroy something that my grandmother left me so your family can avoid facing the consequences of its own decisions." His face went pale. I walked out. That evening, Daniel came home angry. He didn't speak to me for almost an hour. Finally, he said, "You embarrassed me today." I looked up from the kitchen table. I told the truth. "You made my parents feel like criminals. They planned to use my property without even asking me. They were desperate. So was I." He stared at me. "What does that mean?" I took a breath. "It means I'm done being the person everyone comes to when they need something." He shook his head. "You're changing?" "No." I looked directly at him. "I'm finally seeing things clearly." He walked away. I thought that was the end of the conversation. It wasn't. The next morning, I received an email from an attorney. The subject line said, "Urgent property documentation." I opened it, and what I read made my blood run cold. Someone had already started the process of placing a claim against my lake house, without my permission, without my signature, without me knowing. And the person listed on the preliminary paperwork wasn't Richard. It wasn't Linda. It wasn't Jessica. It was my husband, Daniel Mitchell. That was the moment I stopped asking whether my husband was involved. I finally knew he was. And now I had to decide whether I was going to save my marriage or save myself. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that document. My husband's name, my property, a claim I had never authorized. By 6 a.m, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone completely cold. For the first time in 11 years, I wasn't thinking about how to save my marriage. I was thinking about how to protect myself. I called the attorney whose email I had received. Her name was Melissa Grant. She listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, she asked one question. Sarah, did you sign anything giving your husband permission to use the property as collateral? No. Did you give him power of attorney? No. Did you authorize him to contact a lender on your behalf? No. There was a pause. Then she said, good, don't sign anything, don't confront him yet, and don't give anyone access to the original property documents. My stomach tightened. Why? Because if someone has already started preparing paperwork without your authorization, we need to understand exactly what they've attempted to do. I felt sick. Are you saying my husband may have committed fraud? I'm saying we need evidence before we use that word. After the call, I went upstairs. I opened the drawer where I kept my grandmother's original documents. The deed was there. The inheritance papers were there. Everything was exactly where I had left it. I breathed for the first time that morning. Then I noticed something. The folder containing the deed had been opened. I knew because I always kept the papers arranged in a specific order. Someone had looked through them. I didn't need to ask who. Daniel came home around noon. He walked into the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Hey, I looked at him. Where were you? Work. You didn't go to your parents' house? He hesitated. No, I knew he was lying, but I didn't challenge him, not yet. Instead, I asked, did you contact anyone about my lake house? His face changed, only slightly, but enough. No, I held his eyes. Are you sure? Sarah, why are you asking me this? Because I received an email from an attorney. He went completely silent. I watched him carefully. Then he sighed. I was trying to help my family. I felt tears burning my eyes. By using my property without my permission. I wasn't selling it. You tried to put a claim against it. It was temporary. Without telling me, I knew you'd say no. That sentence hurt more than anything else. I whispered, so you knew what you were doing was wrong. He looked away. No, I knew you wouldn't understand. I stood up. I understand perfectly. He began explaining. His father was under enormous pressure. Employees might lose their jobs. Suppliers were threatening legal action. The bank was demanding payment. His mother was terrified. His sister's husband had already invested money. Everyone was desperate. And Daniel believed my property could save them. I listened. Then I asked, why didn't you simply ask me? He didn't answer. I asked again. Why didn't you trust me enough to ask? His eyes filled with tears. Because I knew you'd choose yourself. I felt something inside me go completely quiet. After 11 years of marriage, that was the truth. He knew I would finally choose myself, and he hated me for it. That evening, I packed a small suitcase. Daniel watched from the doorway. Where are you going? To my mother's house. You're leaving me? I need space. You're really going to abandon me when my family needs me? I looked at him. Your family doesn't need me. He frowned. They need the money. No, I zipped the suitcase. They need someone to blame. His expression hardened. You're being cruel. No, Daniel. I picked up my coat. For the first time, I'm being honest. I left. I stayed with my mother for 3 days. During those 3 days, Daniel called constantly. At first, he apologized. Then he begged. Then he became angry. Then he stopped calling. On the 4th day, I received a message from Jessica. You have no idea what you're doing to this family. I didn't respond. 5 minutes later, Dad could lose everything because of you. Still nothing. Then Daniel has done nothing but defend you for years. That one almost made me laugh. Defend me? Was that what they called it? Every time he told me to stay quiet, every time he asked me to apologize, every time he told me his mother didn't mean it. Maybe that was their definition of defense. Mine was different. Later that evening, Melissa called. Sarah, we found something. My heart stopped. What? Your husband contacted a lender 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks? Yes, that was before the family meeting. Correct. What did he tell them? She paused. He represented that he had an ownership interest in the property. I closed my eyes. He had lied, not just to me, to the lender. Melissa continued. But that's not the most concerning part. What is? He also listed the lake house as a family asset. I felt a chill. It isn't a family asset. I know. It belongs to me. I know. There was another pause. Sarah, there's more. I sat down. What? The lender's file includes a valuation report. How did they get that? That's what we're trying to determine. My hands began shaking. The report valued the property at $286,000, but the amount Daniel had requested was only $214,000. That meant there was nearly $72,000 in additional equity. And suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't simply about saving the company. There was enough equity for someone to walk away with money. I asked Melissa, who requested the valuation. She said, "Your husband." I stared at the wall. For years, I had wondered why his family always seemed to know exactly how much money I had. Now I knew they had been studying my life, planning around my assets, and waiting for the right crisis. Then Melissa said something I would never forget. "Sarah, there's one more document." "What document?" "A purchase agreement." My heart stopped. "Purchase agreement for what?" "Your lake house." I couldn't speak. "Who is the buyer?" Melissa hesitated. Then she gave me a name. It was a local investment company. But when she told me who owned that company, I recognized the name immediately. It was connected to someone Daniel's father had done business with for years. This wasn't an emergency loan. It wasn't temporary. They had planned to take my property, and they had already arranged where it would go. I looked at my mother's living room around me. For years, I had believed my biggest fear was losing my husband. Now I realized something. My biggest fear had been staying with him long enough to lose myself. I called Melissa back. "What should I do?" Her answer was simple. "Protect everything you own." I took a deep breath. Then I said something I had never imagined saying about my marriage. "I want to know how much of this was planned." And Melissa replied, "Then we're going to find out." Because the next document we discovered didn't just prove Daniel had betrayed me. It showed that his family had been planning this for almost a year. And I was about to discover exactly why they needed my property so badly. Melissa sent me the document the next morning. I opened the email with trembling hands. It was a series of financial records, emails, and internal notes connected to Daniel's father's construction company. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw the date. 11 months earlier. That was almost a year before the family had told me the company was in trouble. I kept scrolling. I read it again. The cleanest exit, not emergency solution, not temporary help. Exit, I continued reading. They knew the company had been losing money for years. They knew the debt was growing. They knew the business could eventually collapse. And instead of fixing the problem, they had been looking for something valuable enough to cover the losses. Something they didn't have to earn. Something they could take, my property, my grandmother's house. I felt sick. Then I saw another message. It was from Daniel. "She won't agree willingly. We need to make her feel responsible." I put my hand over my mouth. That sentence explained everything. Every accusation, every family argument, every time they told me I wasn't supportive enough. Every time Daniel made me feel guilty for having my own savings. They weren't random. They were preparing me. They wanted me to believe their problems were my responsibility. I called Melissa. "Can this be real?" "Yes." "How did you get these?" "Through the lender's records. Some were included in the file because your husband provided them." I couldn't believe it. Daniel had created the evidence that could expose him. I asked, "What happens now?" "You have several options." "I don't want revenge. I know. I just want my property protected." "Then that's exactly what we're going to do." That afternoon, I returned home. Daniel was sitting in the living room. He looked exhausted. When he saw me, he stood. "Sarah," I put my suitcase down. "We need to talk." He nodded. I sat across from him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I placed my phone on the table. "I know." He stared at me. "Know what?" "Everything." His face changed. I showed him the documents. He read the first page, then the second. His hands started shaking. "Where did you get these?" "That doesn't matter." "Sarah, you planned this for almost a year." He looked down. He didn't answer. I stood. "You wanted me to feel guilty." "No, You told your family I wouldn't help unless they pressured me. I was desperate. You listed my property as a family asset. I was trying to protect everyone. You arranged a buyer. His eyes filled with tears. I never wanted to hurt you. I stared at him. You just wanted what I owned. He shook his head. That's not fair. Then tell me what is fair. He couldn't. Finally, he whispered, I thought once the company survived, everything would go back to normal. I laughed softly. Normal? I looked around our house. Daniel, this hasn't been normal for years. He sat down. His shoulders collapsed. My father said if the company failed, he'd lose everything. And what about me? He looked up. I didn't think you'd actually leave. That sentence told me everything. He had assumed I would stay. He had assumed I would forgive. He had assumed I would eventually sacrifice my property because I was his wife. He had never considered that I might walk away. I went upstairs. I opened my closet. For the first time, I looked at my belongings differently. Most of the things around me had memories attached to them. Our wedding photographs. Our first Christmas together. The blue dress I wore when Daniel proposed. The little wooden box my grandmother had given me. I realized something. I didn't need to take everything. I just needed to take what was mine. The next morning, I moved my important documents, jewelry, personal savings records, and my grandmother's belongings to my mother's house. I also changed my banking passwords. Then I met with Melissa. She filed the necessary paperwork to protect my property and notified the lender that I had never authorized the transaction. The purchase agreement was immediately challenged. The lender stopped moving forward. The buyer backed away. And the family suddenly found itself facing the problem it had spent almost a year avoiding. The company was in real trouble, but now they couldn't use me as their escape route. 3 days later, Richard called. I almost didn't answer. Sarah, his voice sounded different, not angry, not confident, scared. What do you want? We need to talk. We've talked enough. You don't understand what's happening. I understand perfectly, he sighed. Your husband made mistakes. Your whole family did. Please. I remained silent. Then he said, come back. I closed my eyes. Why? Because you're part of this family. I almost laughed. Was I part of the family when you called me selfish? Silence. Was I part of the family when you planned to sell my grandmother's house? Nothing. Was I part of the family when you blamed me for your financial problems? Richard finally said, we're sorry. Those 2 words should have meant something, but they didn't, because apologies without accountability are just another way to delay consequences. I said, I hope you figure things out. Then I hung up. That night, Daniel came to my mother's house. He stood outside for almost 10 minutes before I opened the door. He looked broken. I don't know what to do, he said. I stepped outside. You should have thought about that before you used my name. He nodded. I know. Do you? Yes. He looked at me. I love you. I wanted to believe him. A part of me still did. But love wasn't enough anymore. Love without trust had become another word for pain. I asked him, did you ever plan to tell me the truth? He lowered his head. No, that answer hurt. But it also gave me freedom. I knew what I had to do. I want a divorce. Daniel looked at me as if I had physically struck him. Sarah, I can't do this anymore. Please don't end 11 years. You ended them when you decided my property was more important than my trust. He cried. I cried too. Because leaving someone doesn't mean you stop loving them. Sometimes it means you finally love yourself enough to stop accepting what they are doing to you. I thought that was the end. But 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. The construction company filed for bankruptcy protection. And during the financial review, investigators found something that none of us had known. There was a second account. Money had been moved into it for months. And the person who controlled that account wasn't Richard. It wasn't Linda. It wasn't Daniel. It was Jessica. Suddenly, the story became much bigger than my property. Because the money they said they needed to save the company had already been taken out of it. And now, for the first time, everyone was pointing fingers at each other. When Melissa called me about the second account, I thought I had misunderstood her. Are you sure? Yes, she said. The account belongs to Jessica? Technically, yes, but the transactions are connected to the company. I sat silently at my mother's kitchen table. For months, Daniel's family had told me their company was drowning. They said employees would lose their jobs. They said suppliers were threatening them. They said my grandmother's property was their only chance. But now investigators had discovered that hundreds of thousands of dollars had been moved into an account controlled by Jessica. I asked Melissa, how much? She hesitated. Approximately $176,000. My stomach dropped. Where did it go? We don't know yet. The next few days were chaos. Richard blamed Jessica. Jessica blamed Daniel. Daniel blamed Richard. Linda claimed she knew nothing. And suddenly, the family that had always acted like one united force began tearing itself apart. I stayed out of it. I didn't want their money. I didn't want their business. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted my life back. But I couldn't completely escape the situation, because my name was still connected to some of the financial paperwork. Melissa told me that investigators wanted to speak with me. I agreed. During the meeting, they asked me about Daniel's conversations regarding my property. I told them everything. The folder, the lender, the valuation, the purchase agreement, the emails. And then I gave them copies of every document Melissa had preserved. One investigator looked at the documents for several minutes. Finally, he said, "You were being prepared to take responsibility for a debt you didn't create." I nodded. That was exactly how it felt. He closed the folder. "You did the right thing by getting legal help." For the first time in months, I felt like someone understood. A week later, I received another call from Melissa. "Sarah, there's been a development." What happened? The money in Jessica's account wasn't stolen from the company. I frowned. Then where did it come from? She paused. It came from several investors. I waited. They believed they were investing in a new construction project. I immediately understood. Was there a project? No, my heart sank. Then where did the money go? Some of it was transferred to personal accounts. Whose? Jessica's, Richard's, and one account connected to Daniel? I closed my eyes. Daniel. Even after everything, I had hoped he hadn't known about the money. Now I knew he had. Maybe he hadn't started the scheme. Maybe he hadn't taken the largest amount, but he knew enough to be part of it. And that was all I needed to know. I didn't call him. I didn't confront him. I simply asked Melissa to handle everything legally. Several weeks passed. The divorce process began. Daniel tried to contact me several times. Sometimes he apologized. Sometimes he said he missed me. Once he left a voicemail saying, "I know I don't deserve another chance, but I still love you." I listened to it twice. Then I deleted it, not because I hated him, because I didn't want his voice controlling my emotions anymore. One Saturday afternoon, I drove to my grandmother's lake house. I hadn't been there since everything started. The moment I opened the door, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. The house smelled like old wood and lavender. Sunlight came through the curtains. I walked into the living room and saw the small wooden chair where my grandmother used to sit. I remembered being 12 years old. She had been sitting in that chair, teaching me how to make blueberry pie. I remembered asking her, "Grandma, why do you like this house so much?" She had smiled. "Because nobody can tell me who I have to be here." Those words came back to me so clearly that I started crying. For years, I had been trying to belong in a family that never truly accepted me, and I had forgotten that I already had a place where I belonged. This house wasn't just property. It was freedom. I decided that day not to sell it. I would keep it, not because of the money, because it represented the part of me that I had almost given away. Months later, the investigation finally reached its conclusion. Jessica had been moving investor money through personal accounts. Richard had known about some of the transactions. Daniel had signed documents he shouldn't have signed. The company collapsed. Several people faced serious legal consequences. Daniel wasn't sent to prison, but the financial and legal consequences changed his life completely. The divorce was finalized shortly afterward. Our marriage ended quietly. No dramatic courtroom scene, no screaming, just two signatures on a document that officially ended 11 years together. When I walked out of the courthouse, I expected to feel broken. Instead, I felt strangely light. Daniel stood outside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I hope you're happy." I looked at him. "I hope you are too," he nodded. Then he walked away. I watched him disappear into the parking lot, and for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for what happened to him. That was the hardest lesson of my entire life. You can love someone, you can care about their family, you can spend years helping them, but you cannot save people who are determined to use you as the price of their survival. I thought my story was finally over. But 3 months later, something arrived in my mailbox. It was a letter from Richard. I almost threw it away. Instead, I opened it. The letter was only 2 pages, but one sentence made me stop breathing. Richard admitted that he had known about the plan from the beginning. He admitted that the family had intentionally blamed me for years because they believed guilt would eventually make me give in. Then he wrote something I never expected. "You were never the problem, Sarah. We needed you to believe you were." I sat at my kitchen table holding that letter. And suddenly, all those years of questioning myself came rushing back. Every insult, every accusation, every apology I had made when I had done nothing wrong. I cried. Not because I wanted them back, but because I finally understood that I had spent 11 years trying to fix a problem that was never mine. I folded the letter. I put it away, and I never answered it, because sometimes closure isn't an apology. Sometimes closure is simply realizing you don't need one anymore. A few months later, I made one final decision. I took the money I had saved, repaired my grandmother's lake house, and turned it into something completely different. A place where women could stay temporarily when they needed somewhere safe to start over. I didn't call it a shelter. I called it the Mitchell House. And the first woman who stayed there had a story that sounded painfully familiar. Her husband had convinced her that everything was her fault. Her in-laws had isolated her. And she believed she had nowhere to go. I handed her the spare key. She looked at me and asked, "Why are you helping me?" I smiled. "Because someone helped me remember that I was allowed to choose myself." She started crying. So did I, and in that moment, I realized something. My husband's family thought I walked away with the one thing they needed. They were right, but it wasn't my grandmother's house. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the property. The one thing they needed was my willingness to keep sacrificing myself. And that was the one thing I finally took back. For the first time in 11 years, I woke up without wondering who was angry with me. No phone calls from Linda. No messages from Jessica. No accusations. No apologies that I didn't owe anyone. No husband telling me I needed to understand his family. Just silence. At first, the silence felt strange. Then it became peaceful. I spent the next few months rebuilding my life slowly. I started taking long walks in the mornings. I went back to painting, something I had stopped doing after I married Daniel. I visited my mother more often, and I spent weekends at my grandmother's lake house. But the biggest change wasn't the house. It was me. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped apologizing for saying no. I stopped feeling guilty when someone was disappointed with me. And most importantly, I stopped confusing being needed with being loved. The Mitchell house slowly became a real place. We repaired the roof, painted the bedrooms, replaced the old furniture, created a small office, and made sure anyone who came through the door had somewhere peaceful to breathe. I didn't advertise it. I didn't want attention. It was simply something I wanted to do. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch when my phone rang. It was Daniel. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. "Hello?" There was silence. Then his voice, "Sarah, hi, how are you?" "I'm okay." He took a breath. "I heard about the house." I looked toward the lake. "What about it?" "You're helping other women there." "Yes, I think that's amazing." I didn't know what to say. Then he said, "I finally understand." I waited. "I thought losing you was the worst thing that could happen to me." He paused. "But losing your trust was actually the thing I should have been afraid of." I looked down. He continued. My family blamed you for everything because it was easier than admitting we were failing. I said nothing. I should have protected you. Yes, I said quietly. I know. Another silence. Then he asked, do you hate me? I thought about it. No, why not? Because hate would mean I still want something from you. He didn't answer. I continued. I don't want revenge, Daniel. I know. I don't want your family to suffer. I know. I just don't want to be part of your life anymore. His voice became quiet. I understand. That was the last conversation we ever had. And strangely enough, I wasn't sad. I was relieved. A year after I left Daniel, I stood on the porch of my grandmother's house watching the sunset. There were 3 women staying at the house at that time. One was rebuilding her finances. Another was looking for work. The third was simply trying to figure out what came next. I understood that feeling, because I had once stood in the same place. Unsure, afraid, convinced that leaving meant losing everything. But leaving didn't make me lose everything. It helped me discover what was actually mine. My voice, my choices, my confidence, my future, and my grandmother's house. The same house my husband's family had tried to take. The same house they had valued at $286,000. The same house they believed would solve their problems. I kept it, not because of the money. Because every time I looked at it, I remembered the woman I used to be. And the woman I became. Sometimes people don't realize how much they have taken from you until you stop giving. For years, my husband's family had taken my time, my energy, my patience, my money, my confidence. And eventually they tried to take my property. But there was one thing they never realized. They couldn't take my decision. The decision to walk away. The decision to say no. The decision to stop explaining. The decision to choose myself. If you're listening to my story and you've ever been blamed for things you didn't do, please remember this. You are not responsible for fixing everyone else's life. You are not selfish because you have boundaries. You are not cruel because you say no. And you don't have to destroy yourself just to prove that you love someone. Sometimes walking away isn't giving up. Sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. I used to believe that family meant staying no matter what. Now I understand something different. Family should make you feel safe. Family should protect you. Family should never make you feel like your value depends on what you can give them. And if they only love you when you're useful, then what they love isn't you. It's what you provide. That was the hardest truth I ever learned. But it was also the truth that saved me. Today, I still live near the lake. The house still has my grandmother's old chair. Her recipe book is still in the kitchen. And every Sunday morning, I make blueberry pancakes just like she taught me. Sometimes I sit on the porch with my coffee and think about the woman I was 11 years ago. I wish I could go back and tell her one thing. You don't have to earn your place at the table. You don't have to make everyone happy. And you don't have to stay where you're constantly being blamed. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to start over. And you are allowed to choose yourself. My husband's family thought they had found the one thing that could save them. They thought it was my grandmother's house. They thought it was the money. They thought it was my marriage. But they were wrong. The one thing they needed was the version of me who always said yes. And that woman was gone. I didn't walk away with something they needed. I walked away with something they could never take from me again myself. And honestly, that was worth more than any house, any amount of money, or any marriage ever could be. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more emotional family stories about betrayal, difficult choices, and the courage to start over. And remember, sometimes the person everyone blames is the person who finally has the courage to walk away.